Brigitta Lindquist arrived at the claim on the Sheyenne in the autumn of 1876 and found that her husband's cabin was slowly suffocating in the cold. Elias had been in the ground for nearly a year by then, taken by pleurisy in the autumn of 1875, when the fever came on sudden and his breathing turned shallow as a wounded animal's. And the squared log cabin he had raised with his own hands had proven itself inadequate in ways that only a prairie winter could teach. She stood in the doorway that first morning after the supply run to Timber Falls settlement, stamping the frost from her boots, and watched her breath cloud thick as chimney smoke inside the front room. The thermometer tacked to the inner wall read 43 degrees. It was 9 in the morning. The cabin measured 14 feet wide and 18 feet deep, with walls of squared pine logs 8 inches through, fitted and chined with clay sawdust mortar in the method that had worked adequately for the first winter Elias was alive. But in his absence, and under the weight of a second winter, the mortar had cracked and separated from the logs themselves. The seams had widened to the thickness of a knife blade, some wider. The wind found those seams as water finds a declivity. The interior was losing the battle against the cold with every passing hour. Brigitta set down her parcels, salt, flour, kerosene, a length of burlap, and began the day's labor. She gathered every scrap of fabric she possessed, tore it into strips, and began to caulk the seams from the inside, working the cloth into the gaps with a wooden wedge and a mallet, forcing the fabric deep into the cracks, creating a barrier against the outside air. It took her 4 days of repetitive, methodical work, her arms moving in the same rhythm, hour after hour. By the time she finished, her hands had cracked open in a dozen places, and the frost inside the cabin had receded enough that the thermometer read 51 degrees at dawn. It was not enough. The thermometer still reported inadequacy every morning. The cabin was a sieve with paper patches, and Brigitta knew it. More importantly, she understood why. Her father had taught her the principles in the woods of Värmland when she was 14 years old, working alongside him as he cut and laid the walls of a farmhouse for a family named Eklund. Anders had shown her the specifications of Swedish cordwood masonry, the ancient Kubbhus technique, and explained to her the physics beneath it in his quiet, methodical way. She remembered the weight of an 18-inch round of pine in her hands, the heft of it, the smell of the fresh-cut wood, the slight give of the bark, and the way her father had shown her how to place it end grain outward, then end grain inward, creating a matrix that was both mass and insulation, both substance and craft. He had explained in his measured Swedish that the wood conducts heat along the grain far more efficiently than across it, and that by orienting the end grain to face outward and inward, the Kubbhus wall forced heat to travel the longest path, moving slowly, inefficiently, taking hours to pass through what would take minutes in ordinary construction. The mortar joints, he had said, were not merely adhesive, but thermal mass. They absorbed heat from the fire and released it gradually, buffering the interior temperature against the violent swings of the exterior cold. This was not superstition. This was mathematics. This was the craft that his own father had learned in Värmland, and his father's father before him. She began to plan. Every evening that winter, after the stove had burned down to coals and the cabin had settled into the rhythms of deep cold, she sat by lamplight with a pencil and a pad of foolscap, sketching the sections of a wall. Not the walls she had. Different walls. Better walls. She drew the pine rounds as her father had taught her, showing their end grain, showing the mortar joints between them, showing the courses stacked and mortared, one on top of the next, all the way up to the roof plate. Her pencil sketches grew more detailed as the winter progressed. She made notes in a careful hand. Log length 18 inches. Diameter varied 3 to 9 inches. Mortar joints 2 inches average. Wall thickness 18 inches total. The sketches showed the pattern of the logs, the way they interlocked, how the smallest rounds filled the gaps left by the larger ones, how nothing would be wasted. She calculated as her father had calculated. How many rounds would a 14 by 18 foot cabin require if the walls were 8 feet tall? She worked the problem methodically. 2 walls of 18 feet, 2 walls of 14 feet, each 8 feet tall, with an average wall thickness of 18 inches, accounting for openings for a door and 2 windows. The arithmetic grew complex, but she persisted. Approximately 1,450 rounds, she concluded, perhaps more. She did the work in the margins of the foolscap, testing herself, checking her arithmetic multiple times, understanding the numbers until they meant something in her bones, until she could see the cabin rising in her imagination. Wall by wall, course by course, the prairie waste transformed into shelter. The spring of 1877 came late and reluctant to Dakota Territory, but when it came, Brigitta was ready. She walked the claim in April, moving through the second-growth pine stands that clustered in the low places near the river, marking the trees she would take. She chose them with her father's eyes, the twisted runts unsuitable for squared log construction, the silver-gray standing timber that had weathered to the color of old bone, the wrong lengths that no millwright wanted. She had seen neighbors discard these as waste. Now she understood they were her material. She obtained a cross-cut saw from Mr. Halverson and began the work of felling. One tree at a time, she would position the saw at a height that would yield logs close to 18 inches in length and draw the blade in the rhythm Anders had taught her. The sound of the saw became constant that spring, the shush of the cut, the snap of fibers letting go, the crash of falling timber. She could cut 6 or 7 logs from a single tree if judicious with measurements, and she was always judicious. She paced herself in a measured tempo, sustainable and rhythmic. By noon, she would stop to eat bread and drink from the creek, and by evening, her shoulders burned with the work, but she would return the next morning and begin again. The work fed her in a way widowhood had not permitted. It gave her purpose and presence. By June, a rough stack of 18-inch rounds occupied the south edge of her claim. She had cut perhaps 500 of them, and planned to cut another 1,000 before the sun reached its peak and the wood began to season. The rounds she had already cut she left to air in the stacks, bark still on them, exposed to the dry prairie air. They would need 8 months or more before they were ready to lay. She knew this. Her father had taught her that green wood in a wall was a promise of later failure, shrinkage and warping, gaps that would widen as the seasons passed. Patience was part of the craft. Ursula Mayhew saw the stack in the second week of July. She was making a call on a neighboring wife, the Hendersons' place, 2 claims south, and her route took her past Brigitta's claim. She saw the logs. She rode back to the settlement, and by evening the story had been distributed through the handful of respectable households that existed in Timber Falls. Mrs. Lindquist was stacking firewood as walls, the way peasants did in the old country. The old country, the archaic country. the country that decent people had left behind precisely because it was backward and dark. Ursula made the announcement again, more forcefully, at the trading post the following Saturday. Brigitta was there to purchase lime. She had tested the limestone outcrop 3 miles north and found it adequate for burning. And she heard the remark made loudly enough to be heard by the Hendersons and the Carlsons and old man Peterson. Her husband Hjalmar was with her, and his face had reddened slightly, though whether from embarrassment or anger, Brigitta could not determine. She finished her transaction with Mr. Halverson the trader, paid for the lime in careful dollars, and left without speaking. The summer progressed. By August, Brigitta had cut nearly 1,200 rounds. By September, she had begun the work of debarking them, using a draw knife in long, deliberate strokes, removing the bark to prevent rot, leaving the wood exposed to the air. The debarked rounds resembled smooth, pale clubs, and she stacked them in patterns that would allow maximum air circulation. This work took weeks. Her forearms, already muscular from years of labor, grew more pronounced. Her hands developed new calluses. The work was its own answer to the mockery, not an argument, not a defense, but a response written in motion and effort. By October, the first stack of rounds was ready to use. 8 months had passed since the first cuts. Brigitta selected the best of them, the straightest, the most uniform in diameter, and began to prepare her mortar. The burning of limestone for quicklime was its own project, undertaken in September. She stacked raw limestone with scrap wood, fired it until white as snow, then broken it into fragments. She added water to slake the quicklime, a violent reaction releasing heat and steam, the powder transforming into slaked lime that could be sieved and stored. She had built a long wooden trough, and when ready to mix, combined the components her father had specified. 3 parts slaked lime, 5 parts sand sieved from the Sheyenne, 2 parts sawdust collected from a distant mill, 1 part screened river clay. The proportions had to be precise. Too much lime caused cracking and failure and cold. Too much sawdust made the wall absorb water and fail in freeze-thaw cycles. She mixed the dry materials, then added water slowly, testing consistency with her hands, understanding the material by feel the way her father had taught her. When the mortar was the color of wet wood ash and held together firmly but remained workable, she knew she was ready. The foundation had been prepared in September, a dry stacked fieldstone footing, 18 inches wide, sunk 42 inches into the ground, below the frost line where the Dakota cold could not reach. She had dug that trench herself, working through late August when the ground was softest, and had gathered the fieldstone from the creek bed. The work had been necessary and brutal. Now it would hold the walls that would vindicate or condemn her. In the 3rd week of October, 1877, she laid the first course of cordwood. She set each round end grain facing outward into the air, arranging them closely, filling the small gaps with smaller diameter pieces. Then spread the mortar 2 inches thick on top of the entire row, using a wooden trowel that she had shaped from a piece of birch. Then she set the next layer, orienting these rounds end grain facing inward toward the interior of the wall, their wood grain perpendicular to the round below, creating a cross-hatched pattern that locked the logs together in a 3-dimensional matrix. The 3rd layer faced outward again, the 4th inward, and so on, each layer offset and interlocking, so that a force applied to any single log would be distributed across the entire structure. She worked in courses of approximately 16 inches of wall height, allowing each course to set for at least 2 days before laying the next. The mortar needed time to firm, needed to bond with the wood, needed to reach a state of partial hardness where the weight of the course above would not cause settling or slumping. She understood this patience as part of the craft. One could not hurry masonry. The work was methodical, repetitive, and demanded absolute attention. A misaligned log would throw off the courses above it, creating a lean to the wall that would worsen with each course. A mortar joint too thin would create a weak point, a place where the logs touched without the thermal buffering of the mortar between them, where heat could be conducted directly from one side of the wall to the other. A joint too thick would waste material and compromise the wall's structural integrity by introducing unnecessary voids into the matrix. The settlement watched. The wives in their respectable households whispered about the widow with her pile of logs and her mixing trough, working through the autumn like a man, like a servant, like something not quite respectable. Ursula made her visits and told her stories. At the church gathering in November, she announced to the assembled wives that she worried for Brigitta's reputation, that such work was unseemly, that the Lindquist family name, meaning her own family through marriage to Hjalmar, was suffering from association with such backwardness. The other wives, uncertain and inclined to defer to Ursula's superior knowledge of propriety, nodded and murmured and adjusted their opinions accordingly. Brigitta continued to lay walls. By April 1878, the cabin was rising. The walls had reached a height of 6 feet. By June, they had reached 7 feet. The work had taken months, longer than she had projected, because the mortar had to cure between courses, because the weather had been cold and wet in the spring, slowing the drying, because the simple physics of lifting thousands of pounds of stone and wood and mortar had taken a toll on her body that she had not wholly anticipated. By August, her shoulders ached in ways that kept her awake at night, and her hands had developed a tremor in the morning that did not fully resolve until she had worked for an hour and generated heat. But the walls were rising, and as they rose, something in Brigitta seemed to rise with them. She had been hollow in the years after Elias's death, not sad in a way that permitted expression, but empty in the way that an abandoned house is empty. The work filled her. The work had purpose. The work was conversation with her departed father, speaking in the language of wood and mortar that he had taught her. The final course went on in late October 1878. She had used approximately 1,450 rounds total, and her calculations had been correct. The walls were exactly 18 inches thick, the width of each round from end to end, creating a surface that was smooth and unified, that looked, from a distance, almost like ordinary log construction. But up close, running a hand along the wall, one could feel the individual rounds beneath the mortar skin, could understand that something new had been made here, something that combined the thermal properties of wood with the structural stability of stone construction that was at once entirely local, built from the waste material that the prairie itself discarded, and entirely ancient, descended from the forests of Värmland, from the hands of master builders who had understood cold and wood and fire and survival. In November 1878, Ursula arrived at Brigitta's door. She was accompanied by Hjalmar, and her manner was stiff and formal in the way that American courtesy could be when it was meant to convey disapproval wrapped in propriety. She asked to see the cabin. Brigitta, without speaking much, showed her through. The interior walls were still rough, The mortar joints required pointing, the final finishing work that would smooth and seal the seams. But already the cabin felt different. It felt, somehow, built. More substantially built than any structure Brigitta had seen in Dakota Territory. Ursula walked the interior, examining the walls with an expression that Brigitta could not quite read, and then left without comment. The work of pointing and finishing the mortar joints took until December. Brigitta shaped the mortar in each joint carefully, deliberately, creating a subtle pattern that was both utilitarian and beautiful, that would shed water and last for decades. By the time the first snow came, the cabin was complete and ready for the cold ahead. She stood in the interior on the first truly cold night of the season. The thermometer outside read 14 degrees, and the wind was coming down from the northwest with the smell of Arctic ice in it, and she fired the stove. She used 3 logs, carefully selected and measured. At midnight, she banked the fire down carefully, closing the draft to let the coals sleep. She placed a thermometer on a shelf in the far corner of the cabin and went to bed, curious about what the walls would prove. The next morning, the outside thermometer read -4 degrees. Inside the cabin, the thermometer read 49 degrees. The fire had been completely out for 8 hours. Winter came to Dakota Territory in 4 winters now. 4 seasons of cold and wind and snow from 1878 through 1882. And in each one, Brigitta's cabin performed the same miracle of physics and craft. The first winter, 1878 to 1879, was a proving ground. She carefully measured her firewood consumption, keeping careful notes of how much she burned each day, how the interior temperature responded, how the walls themselves seemed to radiate a steady warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. By the end of that winter, she had burned approximately 1/4 of the wood her neighbors consumed. By the second winter, the ratio had stabilized. 1/3 the firewood of a squared log cabin, achieving nearly identical interior temperatures. The mechanism was precise and replicable. Her cabin's interior remained between 58 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit when the outside temperature plummeted to -35. The walls retained heat for 16 to 20 hours after she allowed the stove to go out. The air inside had no drafts, no cold seeping in around gaps, no requirement for constant rechinking and plugging of seams. While neighbors burned enormous quantities of firewood, filling their cabins with smoke and cold in equal measure, Brigitta burned perhaps 1/3 as much wood and remained warm. Her cabin became legendary in a quiet way, spoken of in the settlement as an oddity, a peculiarity, something interesting but not quite trustworthy, because it contradicted the understanding that you could not be warm unless you burned an enormous fire, unless you lived in noise and smoke and the constant labor of feeding wood into an insatiable stove. The understanding itself seemed to them more trustworthy than the evidence before their eyes. Ursula maintained her campaign. The other wives continued to keep a distance. By the winter of 1880, Brigitta had stopped going to church gatherings, stopped making attempts to be part of the settlement's social life, had become, in effect, a neighbor rather than a member of the community. She did not defend herself. She did not explain. She simply lived in her cabin, burned less wood than anyone else, and remained warm. The years passed. 1878 became 1879, then 1880, then 1881, then 1882. The settlement grew slowly. New claims were staked. A few more cabins were built, all of them in the traditional squared log or clapboard over stud construction that the other settlers understood. Brigitta's cabin sat at the edge of the settlement, solid and unusual, a monument to something that the community had decided was backward. And then, in the second week of January, 1883, the winter that everyone would remember arrived. The temperature began to drop on Tuesday. It fell from 10 degrees Fahrenheit to -5, then to -15. By Thursday, the thermometer showed -35 degrees. The wind, which had been steady and cold, became ferocious, 50 miles per hour sustained, gusting to 70, coming down from the northwest with the force of something alive and malevolent. The snow came with it, not in the gentle accumulation of a normal winter, but in great walls of white that moved sideways through the air. 3 feet accumulated in the first 48 hours, with drifts that reached 10 and 15 feet in places where the wind had worried the snow into great masses. The settlement began to burn through its firewood stores with increasing desperation. Cabins that had seemed adequately warm began to lose the battle. The squared log structures, with their crooked seams and the constant need for rechinking, began to leak cold. The clapboard over stud houses, insulated with whatever materials had been available, felt batting purchased from the commercial merchant, sawdust, straw, began to fail. By the third day of the blizzard, Brigitta could hear neighbors passing, the Carlsons, the Hendersons, going to and from the settlement store or each other's houses, their voices carrying across the snow, urgent and frightened. The firewood that had seemed adequate was running low. The cold that had seemed like it could be managed was not being managed anymore. On the 4th day of the blizzard, there was a knock on Brigitta's door. She had been sitting by the stove, mending a shirt, with the interior of the cabin maintaining its steady temperature. 59 degrees, sometimes reaching 63 at the warmest part of the afternoon. She had fired the stove 3 times since the blizzard began, each time burning just enough wood to keep the cabin comfortable. Her supply, which had seemed generous in November, was still substantial. She rose and opened the door, and Ursula Mayhew stood in the snow, hollow-cheeked and shaking, wearing a coat that was clearly inadequate for the temperature, with ice on her eyebrows and her lips gone slightly blue. Hjalmar was behind her, carrying what looked like the remainder of their firewood, 3 logs, perhaps 4, no more. Ursula did not speak. She simply stood there, waiting. Brigitta stepped aside and gestured for them to enter. Ursula crossed the threshold with the stiffness of someone who had been cold for a long time, and Hjalmar followed, his face bearing the expression of someone who had wanted to do this several hours earlier, but had been prevented by pride. The interior of the cabin received them. It was warm. The air was neither smoky nor thin, but rather substantial and comfortable, the temperature steady and reliable. The walls themselves, if one had looked closely, would have revealed their secret. The cordwood beneath the mortar, the individual rounds locked together in their matrix, radiating back the heat from the stove with the combination of mass and insulation that physics provided. But no one was looking closely at the walls. Ursula was looking at the thermometer, which read 61 degrees. Hjalmar was looking at the small amount of firewood that remained in the wood box. Enough, clearly, for many more days of warmth. Ursula was looking at Brigitta, and something in her face had broken. They stayed for 5 days. The blizzard continued. The temperature did not rise above -28 degrees. Outside, the wind continued to scream. Inside Brigitta's cabin, the temperature remained steady. She fired the stove twice a day, morning and evening, burning perhaps 1 cord of wood for every 10 that her neighbors would have needed to maintain the same heat. Hjalmar did not speak much, but Ursula began to speak. Not to apologize, that was not a word that came easily to her, but to ask questions. How had you learned to build this way? Is it truly as warm as it seems? How much wood does it use in a normal winter? Will you teach us how you did it? Brigitta answered each question simply and directly. She did not offer recriminations. She did not say that she had tried to be part of the settlement and had been rejected. She did not say that the mockery had been heard, that the campaign had been understood, that the pain of isolation had been real. She simply explained the technique, the specifications, the reason that end grain orientation mattered, the precise composition of the mortar, the 8 months of curing that the rounds required. She showed Ursula the proportions written in her careful hand: 3 parts slaked lime, 5 parts sand, 2 parts sawdust, 1 part clay. She demonstrated how to test the mortar's readiness by feeling it, by understanding its texture beneath the fingers. She explained why the courses had to cure between layering, why you could not rush the wall upward. She spoke about her father, about Värmland, about the forests she had known. She told Ursula about Anders, showing her the principle of end grain as a young woman, about watching her father build 6 Kubbhus structures across Värmland farms, about the way his hands had understood the wood in ways that words could not quite capture. She spoke in the language of craft and material, of respect for wood and stone and the work of human hands. She did not speak with bitterness or defensiveness. She spoke as one explaining something true, something that had proven itself in the cold and the wind. On the 9th day of the blizzard, the wind began to ease. The temperature remained far below 0, but the violence of the storm started to break. By the afternoon of the 10th day, the blizzard had passed. The settlement emerged from the wreckage to discover that a number of cabins had barely survived, that fires had burned constantly, that firewood stores had been exhausted, or nearly so. Some families had huddled together in the largest cabin that the community could offer. Some had burned furniture to maintain heat. Some had faced the real possibility that they might not survive the winter. Brigitta's cabin had remained steady throughout. 61 degrees inside, 3 small fires, firewood remaining, the walls holding, the craft vindicated. Ursula and Hjalmar left on the morning of the 11th day, returning to their own cabin to assess what remained, and to begin the work of understanding what they would need to do differently when the next winter came. Ursula paused at the door and looked at Brigitta with an expression that was something more than gratitude and something different than shame. It was, perhaps, a kind of understanding, the recognition that there are different ways of being competent, different ways of being respectable, and that the old ways, if they were truly understood and executed with care, were not backward but rather appropriate to their place and purpose. Within months of the blizzard's end, 3 more cabins of cordwood masonry were begun in Timber Falls. Brigitta did not build them herself, though the labor would have been no hardship. She had discovered in the building of her own walls that she was not made for idleness, that work fed something essential in her nature. Instead, she taught the techniques to others, to a Norwegian settler named Jakobsen, to a Swede named Blomqvist, to the blacksmith's son who had the strength and patience to understand the work. She walked their claims with them, showed them how to identify the waste timber that was in fact perfect material, taught them to feel the mortar's readiness, demonstrated the proper angle and pressure for laying each round. The the specifications that she had sketched in lamplight in the bitter cold of 1876. The proportions that her father had taught her in Värmland when she was a young woman learning the ancient craft became the template for construction in Dakota Territory. The wasteful timber, the twisted rounds, the silver-gray standing pine, the wrong lengths that no mill wanted, became a building material of choice, no longer discarded, but harvested deliberately for its utility. The technique that Ursula had called backward became, quite quietly and without announcement, the practical wisdom that the settlement embraced. It was not a revolution. No proclamation was issued. No credit was assigned. It simply became the way things were built, because it worked, because it was logical, because the land itself provided the materials and the climate itself demanded the performance. Years passed. By 1890, when Dakota Territory became a state, Brigitta was in her early 40s and had built, or trained others to build, nearly a dozen cordwood structures. Some of them were cabins, some were barn walls. One was a substantial house with 2 stories and multiple rooms. All of them stood warm against the prairie winters. All of them outlasted, by decades, the squared log structures that had seemed so permanent. In time, the technique became simply how things were built in that part of the world, not because it was traditional, but because it worked, because it was efficient, because it was true to the material and true to the climate and true to the labor available. Brigitta Lindquist remained a quiet woman. She never married again. She never sought recognition for her work, but the walls stood. They stood through the winters, through the decades, through the coming of the 20th century. And in those walls, for anyone who knew how to look, was the knowledge of a Swedish carpenter named Anders Lindquist, and the memory of forests in Värmland, and the skill of his daughter, who had learned to build with wood and mortar and time, and who had understood that the only defense worth offering against mockery was to build something true,